What if America didn't lose wars because of weakness, but because it misunderstood who it was fighting? Not the weapons, not the terrain, the mindset. From Vietnam to Iraq, again and again, the United States faced an enemy it couldn't fully read. And when you don't understand your enemy, you fight the wrong war. If you care about American military history and want deeper analysis like this, make sure to like the video. It helps more than you think. America did not walk into these wars unsure. It walked in confident. After World War II, after Korea, after becoming the most technologically advanced military force on Earth, there was a belief that no opponent could truly match American power. Satellites in the sky, aircraft carriers in every ocean, precision strikes that could hit a single building in the dark. It felt unstoppable. And on paper it was. The numbers always told the same story. More aircraft, more armor, more funding, more training. Every measurable category leaned in one direction. But wars are not spreadsheets, and enemies are not statistics. In Vietnam, American forces could win almost every major engagement. They could dominate the battlefield. They could measure success in body counts and cleared zones. And yet something didn't add up. How do you win every battle and still feel like you're losing the war? That question lingered quietly at first. Then it grew louder. The assumption had been simple. Superior firepower would break the opponent's will. That overwhelming force would make resistance irrational. But what if the enemy was not calculating the same way? What if survival, identity, and belief outweighed casualties? In Vietnam, many fighters were not thinking about air superiority or logistics chains. They were thinking about land, history, independence. Their motivation did not fit neatly into Western military models. And that gap mattered, because when you misunderstand what drives your opponent, you misjudge how much pressure they can endure. The United States measured progress in terrain taken and enemies eliminated. The opposing forces measured progress in time survived and resolve maintained. Those are two different scoreboards, and they rarely align. The illusion was not about arrogance. It was about perspective. American planners believed that modern warfare had evolved beyond ideology and local identity, that industrial strength and precision would define the future. Instead, they encountered an enemy who fought in villages, who blended into communities, who did not separate civilian life from conflict the way traditional doctrine expected. The battlefield was not just physical, it was cultural, and culture is harder to map than terrain. Fast forward decades later, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the same pattern began to surface. Advanced surveillance, rapid invasions, swift removal of regimes. Mission accomplished. But then what? Insurgencies do not line up for conventional fights. They do not present clear fronts. They do not rely on symmetrical strength. They adapt. They disperse. They wait. And once again, American superiority in technology did not automatically translate into understanding, because understanding requires more than intelligence reports. It requires seeing how the other side sees the world. When a soldier believes he is defending his homeland against foreign presence, the calculus shifts. When a community views resistance as honor rather than rebellion, pressure can harden resolve instead of breaking it. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. If you believe your advantage guarantees compliance, you may underestimate the power of belief on the other side. And belief does not show up on radar. America prepared to defeat armies. Often it faced movements. It trained to win decisive engagements. Often, it encountered decentralized networks. It expected surrender after shock and awe. Instead, it found endurance. The illusion of superiority was not about weakness. The United States remained the most powerful military force in the world. But power without full understanding can lead to fighting the right battles for the wrong reasons. And when your strategy assumes the enemy values the same things you do, you risk building plans on a foundation that does not exist. The deeper question isn't whether America was stronger. It was. The deeper question is this: stronger at what? Winning battles? Or shaping outcomes? Because if your opponent defines victory differently, then superiority in your own framework may not decide the war. And that realization would slowly reshape how modern conflicts are understood, but not before repeating itself more than once. What if the battlefield was never the real battlefield? What if the decisive front line wasn't in the jungle or the desert, but in the minds of civilians watching from home? For decades, American military doctrine focused on decisive force. Identify the enemy. Engage. Overwhelm. Win. Clear objectives. Clear targets. But insurgencies don't operate inside clear lines. In Vietnam, the United States approached the conflict with conventional logic. Secure territory. Disrupt supply lines. Eliminate enemy concentrations. Measure progress through quantifiable results. And at first glance, the metrics looked promising. Villages cleared. Operations completed. Enemy losses mounting. But something felt unstable, because the opposing side was not trying to win the same kind of war. They were not seeking large-scale battlefield victories. They were not trying to defeat American forces head-on in sustained combat. They were trying to survive, and survival changes everything. If your objective is to outlast rather than overpower, you make different decisions. You conserve strength. You avoid decisive engagements. You blend into civilian spaces. You turn time into your ally. Suddenly, every tactical victory becomes temporary. An area cleared today could shift tomorrow. A leader captured might be replaced next week. A road secured might become contested again. The war becomes fluid, and frustration grows. Because when you fight a political movement as if it were only a military opponent, you may solve the wrong problem. In many of these conflicts, the center of gravity was not the enemy's weapons. It was public perception. It was legitimacy. It was narrative. Insurgent groups understood something fundamental. They did not need to defeat the United States militarily. They needed to make the cost of staying feel heavier than the cost of leaving. That calculation was not made on distant battlefields. It was made in living rooms across America. Every prolonged deployment, every rising casualty report, every unclear objective, each one shifted public patience slightly, and democracies operate on patience. Elections approach. Media cycles accelerate. Public opinion fluctuates. Time is visible. Insurgent movements often operate differently. They do not face the same electoral pressures. They are not constrained by 4-year cycles. They measure time in decades if necessary. So the conflict becomes asymmetrical in more than just weapons. It becomes asymmetrical in endurance. In Iraq, the initial invasion phase moved swiftly. Major objectives were achieved with speed and precision. Regime change occurred faster than many predicted. It appeared decisive, but after the conventional phase ended, something more complex emerged. Sectarian tensions, local power struggles, decentralized cells, roadside bombs instead of front lines. The battlefield shifted from open engagements to urban neighborhoods, and the objective shifted too. It was no longer just about removing a government. It was about stabilizing a society. That is not purely a military task. That is political, social, cultural, and far more unpredictable. The same pattern surfaced in Afghanistan. Rapid initial success, then a long, grinding effort to build institutions, secure regions, train local forces, and reshape governance structures. But institutions are not built through firepower alone, and governance cannot be imposed solely through security operations. When the underlying conflict is about identity, power, and legitimacy, military action addresses only part of the equation. The rest unfolds in classrooms, in mosques, in markets, in quiet conversations that never appear on intelligence briefings. This is where the misunderstanding deepens. If strategy is centered primarily on battlefield dominance, but the opponent's strategy is centered on political erosion, the two sides are not contesting the same arena. One side is counting tactical wins. The other is counting weeks. One side is measuring destroyed equipment. The other is measuring public doubt. And doubt can be powerful. The most dangerous misunderstanding may not be underestimating strength. It may be underestimating purpose. Because if the enemy's true objective is to reshape perception rather than seize territory, then territory becomes secondary. And if you focus on holding ground while they focus on shaping narrative, you may secure space while losing influence. That tension defines modern asymmetric warfare. The conflict extends beyond borders, beyond maps, beyond traditional doctrine. And until that shift is fully understood, every tactical success risks being temporary. Because you might be fighting efficiently, You might be fighting bravely. You might even be fighting successfully in the conventional sense. But if the war itself is political at its core, then the decisive victory will never be found only on the battlefield. What if time was the most powerful weapon on the battlefield? Not missiles, not drones, not armored divisions. Time. In every modern conflict, there is a clock. For the United States, that clock is visible. It ticks through election cycles, through budget approvals, through news headlines, through public opinion polls. Time is measured, debated, questioned. How long will this take? What is the exit strategy? When do our troops come home? These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of democracy. But democracy has rhythm, and rhythm creates pressure. Insurgent movements often operate differently. They do not face national elections every 4 years. They do not answer to nightly news coverage. They do not brief shareholders or voters. They endure. In Vietnam, this contrast became painfully clear. American leadership sought measurable progress within a reasonable time frame. Escalation was designed to create pressure. Bombing campaigns were meant to accelerate outcomes. Increased troop deployments were meant to shift momentum quickly. The assumption was simple: apply enough force, and the opponent will reach a breaking point. But what if the opponent's breaking point is much farther away? What if their strategy is not to win quickly, but to not lose at all? North Vietnamese forces and Viet Cong fighters operated with a different horizon. Their struggle was tied to national identity and long-term unification. Casualties were devastating, but the political objective remained constant. They were prepared for a prolonged conflict. They believed time was on their side. And slowly, the American clock began to matter more than battlefield maps. As years passed, public questions grew louder. Protests increased. Confidence fluctuated. The war was no longer just overseas. It was part of everyday American life. Television brought distant combat into living rooms. Time became visible. The longer the conflict stretched without a clear, decisive conclusion, the more strategic pressure shifted. And the enemy understood that. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the same dynamic reappeared. Initial military operations moved rapidly. Regimes fell. Capitals were secured. Conventional resistance collapsed. But then the war changed shape. Insurgencies formed. Roadside bombs replaced open battles. Attacks were designed not to conquer territory, but to signal persistence. Each small strike carried a message: we are still here. And each passing year carried another message back home: this is not over. The United States rotated troops through multiple deployments. Strategies adjusted. Surges were implemented. Timelines were revised. But the clock never stopped. In Washington, discussions centered on sustainability. How long can funding continue? How long can public support hold? How long can alliances remain stable? Meanwhile, insurgent groups operated with a different calculus. If they avoided decisive defeat, they considered that success. If they maintained presence, they considered that progress. If they could simply remain, they believed the balance would eventually tilt. They were not trying to defeat America militarily. They were trying to outlast it. That difference changes everything, because a democracy must constantly justify its commitments. It must explain objectives clearly. It must demonstrate progress. It must show that sacrifice leads somewhere tangible. An insurgent movement does not face the same expectations. Patience becomes asymmetric, and asymmetry in patience can reshape outcomes as much as asymmetry in firepower. This is not about courage. American soldiers demonstrated extraordinary resilience across every theater. This is not about capability. The military remained unmatched in conventional strength. It is about strategic timelines. When one side fights for a defined mission and the other fights for generational transformation, their tolerance for duration will rarely align. If victory must occur within a political window, but the opponent is comfortable waiting beyond that window, pressure builds unevenly. The longer the conflict continues without clear closure, the more the domestic clock influences strategic decisions. Withdrawals become discussions. Negotiations become options. Reframing objectives becomes necessary. And eventually, the definition of success itself begins to shift. Time does not announce its influence loudly. It works quietly, day after day, year after year. until one side decides the cost of continuing outweighs the potential gain. And when that moment arrives, it may not reflect a battlefield collapse. It may reflect a clock running out. The deeper question remains, can a nation built on cycles of accountability sustain wars defined by indefinite timelines? And if the enemy understands that tension better than we do, then patience becomes more than a virtue. It becomes strategy. What if the most dangerous mistake isn't losing a war, but failing to recognize the pattern before it begins again? History rarely repeats itself in identical form, but it often echoes. Vietnam was supposed to be unique, a product of the Cold War, a lesson learned the hard way. And yet, decades later, familiar elements resurfaced. A rapid initial intervention, confidence in overwhelming capability, a belief that superior force could shape political outcomes quickly. At first, it worked. In Iraq, the opening phase moved with precision. Strategic targets were neutralized. Major cities were secured. The world watched a display of modern military dominance. It looked decisive, but decisive moments are not the same as decisive endings. Soon, the conflict shifted, not into conventional battles between armies, but into fragmented resistance, improvised attacks, unclear front lines. Afghanistan followed a similar arc. Initial operations dismantled established power structures swiftly. There was a sense that the hardest phase had passed. But beneath the surface, deeper dynamics were still active. Local loyalties, tribal identities, religious motivations, regional rivalries. These forces do not disappear because a capital changes hands. They adjust. And once again, the United States faced an environment where military superiority did not automatically translate into long-term stability. The pattern was not about weakness. It was about expectation. Each intervention began with a defined objective: remove a threat, disrupt a network, prevent future attacks. Those goals were concrete, but what followed required something more complex: rebuilding institutions, reshaping governance, influencing culture, fostering legitimacy. That is not a short campaign. That is generational work. And here the earlier lessons returned quietly. Technology dominated early phases. Speed created momentum. Confidence shaped planning. But insurgencies emerged. Public patience fluctuated. Time extended beyond initial projections. And the central tension resurfaced: military success versus political resolution. The enemy was never invisible. They signaled their strategy clearly: endure, adapt, wait. The question is not whether America can win battles. It consistently has. The question is whether it can align military power with political reality in environments shaped by identity and history. Because when interventions are framed primarily through capability, the deeper terrain may remain under-examined. Terrain not made of mountains or cities, but of memory, of belief, of grievance. If those elements are underestimated, the cycle risks restarting. A new region, a new threat, a new justification. But familiar assumptions. The danger of patterns is not that they are hidden. It is that they feel different each time. Different names, different leaders, different landscapes, yet similar dynamics beneath. This is not an argument against strength. Strength matters. It deters adversaries. It protects interests. It safeguards allies. But strength without full contextual understanding can lead to prolonged friction. And prolonged friction tests democracies in unique ways. The deeper reflection is uncomfortable, not because it questions courage, but because it questions frameworks. If future conflicts emerge, and history suggests they will they be approached through the same lens? Or will the lessons of patience, perception, and political complexity reshape strategy before boots ever touch the ground? The enemy America never understood was not defined solely by weapons. It was defined by worldview, by timeline, by purpose. And when those elements go misread, even overwhelming capability can struggle to produce lasting outcomes. So here's the question that lingers. Are we preparing for the next war? Or are we preparing to understand the next enemy? Because those are not always the same thing. If this analysis made you see these conflicts from a new angle, take a second to support the channel with a like. And tell me in the comments, do you think the pattern has truly changed? Or are we still learning the same lesson? History doesn't shout. It whispers. The question is whether we're listening.